And welcome to Thumbing Through Yesterday, the podcast where we take our favorite books off the shelf, dust them off, and remind ourselves why we love them. I'm Tom Galley, and joining me today is...
Tony Pasquuli. Thanks for having me back again for 25 episodes in a row.
Yes, this episode marks the commencement of our second year of podcasting here. Phenomenally important and had to be celebrated by none less than Robert Henlein.
Robert Henlein, who we've had before and who I think we've both mentioned, if we weren't intent on trying not to repeat authors much, would be like half of the entries.
I've got at least 4 Henlein books on my list that we'll get to eventually. And this time around, I picked The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
So why of all the Henlein books, because we know we both love Henlein, but why of all the Henlein books, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress? Why this book?
You know, I think this may well have been my first Henlein.
Okay.
It has always
that would do it.
Stuck with me. And there are elements in it that I really love. The relationship between Mike and Mann.
Yes.
There's a couple of one-liners we'll hit going through there during the war.
Mm-hmm.
Throw the word war into air quotes there. There was a lot of this I had forgotten. It's been a while since I read this.
Likewise.
And I had forgotten a lot of Henlein's showing off how much Henlein knows and what Henlein thinks about things. But in terms of the story, I had a pretty good recollection of how the story went. And it's just a good, satisfying story.
It really is, although it's also a very Henlein story with, scrappy underdogs that are smarter than their opponents and a lot of politics, but weird Heinleinian politics. Yeah.
This one's a little bit different in that the smarter than their opponents, that's one notable exception in this. That's Mike is the only reason that this thing comes off, the only reason that this can succeed. Because nobody else is particularly bright. I mean, the professor has got some book learning, but, even Mann, who's, arguably the protagonist of this book, he's reasonably intelligent, reasonably competent, reasonably grounded man, but he ain't nothing special,
He's street smart, and he has advantages that Henlein gives him. But he clearly no one is capable of pulling off this revolution without the assistance of Mike.
Yep.
Yeah. So Mike, for those who haven't read the story yet, is an intelligent computer. One of my favorite AIs in fiction. I think he's a fantastic character. Yeah. We'll
start with Mike. Why not? I love the fact that he's so bored he starts playing jokes, right? And this is how Mann discovers that Mike is more than just a computer.
Yes.
And the entire basis for their relationship is that Mann acknowledges Mike is, to some degree or another, alive and sentient and treats him as such.
Yes.
Mike is only doing this because he's bored and his friend wants him to do it. He's leading a revolution, which includes killing a lot of people, which one would think a computer might have problems with. But no, he's doing it because his friend asked him to do it, and he's got nothing better to do, literally.
He is, and this is a trope of, I don't know if it's a trope or just a characteristic of Henlein novels, but in Henlein novels, people fall... They form immediate, intense attachments and bonds with other people.
Yes.
It's like you're either my people or you're not. And if you are, it's like ride or die from the word go. And that's what Mike does here. It's like, oh, you're my people? Yeah. You're starting a revolution? Of course I'm in. Yeah, there
exactly.
we go. Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, I can't remember the novel. I should have looked it up. Mike has a cameo in a later Henlein book. They have preserved him. They have preserved Mike, and I think he's in a museum of some sort, but they have him powered up and connected, and they're just keeping him alive and maintained, hoping that one day he's going to wake up again, hoping that he's going to come out of whatever the coma is. He's a paragraph at best in another novel, but he's still, in the future, they have preserved Mike.
Is that The Cat Who Walks Through Walls or Sail Beyond the Sunset, one of those?
It may well be. I don't remember. I just remember it being. I remember as I was reading the thing, going, "That's Mike. Yeah. I know it. No, now I'm sad." And then the novel moves on past it. It never comes back to him again. But
Henlein comes back to the idea of artificial computers or artificially intelligent computers in the sequel. I think of them as sequels to Time Enough for Love, the Lazarus Long book. Mm-hmm. So Sail Beyond the Sunset and The Cat Who Walks Through Walls are both of those.
You see, I think I'm going to have to put a fifth Heinlein book on my list now.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten about the cat who walks through walls.
Yeah, and both of those, I think, feature AIs who eventually become embodied because they want to experience what it is to be fully human, which in Heinlein's estimation includes lots of sex. Yeah.
There was surprisingly little sex in this for a Heinlein novel. That was actually a comment I was going to make.
Interesting. There is not a lot of actual sex, but there's a lot of discussion of sex.
There's a bit of discussion of sex. There's an awful lot of discussion about marriage.
Yes, that too.
And this is one of the things that he spends a lot of the book showing off. Look at all these different forms of marriage I've either come across or imagined. See how neat it is?
Yeah, I like the idea of line marriage. Group marriage is something that has been tried on Earth, and I think mostly to ill effect, usually in the form of bigamy. Where one man, multiple wives. Very rarely do you have equal group marriages. But here he's got this idea of a line marriage where it's two people and they just bring in younger junior wives, junior husbands, keeping the balance so that the family has this extended run and they accumulate a lot of resources and a lot of wisdom. And you have this sort of, you have this it takes a village thing, but built into your family.
It's a really neat concept.
Yeah. I don't know that. I think there are very few people on Earth who have the actual lack of jealousy and emotional maturity to pull something like that off. And I think, people who would be into it would be mostly into exploiting it for its advantages. But if you had the people who were into it, it seems like a very workable structure.
Well, you needed this. Now, the lunar colony, and this is probably part of why he sets it there, right?
Yes.
So originally it was a penal colony,
yes,
right? And a percentage of the people who are up there are in fact prisoners,
yeah.
But the majority of the people, are either descendants of prisoners or they are former prisoners,
or
but
they're born free, yeah.
Or they could have been, they were born descendants thereof, but they can't leave,
yes.
right? They're effectively trapped. They're effectively prisoners of the moon, whether or not they're actually prisoners. Yeah. But he talks about in the early days, with the male to female ratio was so radically off, as is typical of penal colonies, that women developed this unquestioned, unchallenged authority.
Yeah.
And I think you have a scenario like that. It's a little more fertile ground for line marriages or various forms of group marriages that can actually work.
Yeah, where you can. Without being gross about it, share women more effectively without people getting contentious about it. It's like this woman is married to multiple men and they're okay with it because they get a fraction of a woman as opposed to no woman at all. Yeah. Because it's the ratio something like 10 to 1, I think.
And it was down to 2 to 1.
By the time of the book.
By the time of the book, in the early days of
when a lot
sort
of
of
mores
civilization.
formed, it was 10
like
to
10
1.
To 1.
So.
And the most polite society ever. Because the people who can't get along don't live long.
Yes.
I love that. That sort of a polite rule by mob.
Somewhere he says that they're talking about bringing in people from Earth once they've established themselves an independent colony. And it's like, you can immigrate. And then they don't mention the fact that the average lifespan for a new resident of Luna is 6 months.
Yep.
Yeah. If you make it past 6 months, you're likely to make it for a full year. If you make it for a year, you're probably good to go. Yeah.
And I kind of enjoyed the fact that he grants the residents of Luna extended life. I'm not sure that evens out. I mean, less wear and tear on the body under gravity is one thing, but the high radiation levels and what. I think he might be playing a little loose with reality there.
I don't know. I mean, that's something I've run across in other science fiction novels where I can't remember who now. Is it Stevenson? Where they film big colonies in space around the L4 and L5 points, and people get to a certain age and they just move up to those. That's retirement homes are all in space, in low Earth orbit, or high Earth orbit actually, because it's so much less stressful on the body. So, I mean, it's terrible. The reason we think of it as really bad for your health is because it's bad for your health if you're planning to return to Earth.
True.
That's a disaster. Yeah. But if you're never coming back to Earth, then it's great.
Yeah.
Except for the radiation.
I did like the fact that they dodged the sun, right? They didn't like going out on the surface if the sun was up.
Yeah.
And he makes a note about, radiation exposure and how aware they are of it.
Yeah.
This, as far as Heinlein books go, is really light on the sci-fi portion of the sci-fi.
Really?
He
How so?
really steers away from opportunities and mistakes I think other authors would make. He doesn't plunge into the details. He doesn't plunge into the science or the fictional science.
He's got a whole thing on orbital mechanics where I think he works out the math.
Okay, he does talk at length about orbital mechanics as a plot device there, but things that he avoids. He never gives us a number for how big the cylinders are, what the mass of the cylinders are, what the impact actually is. He gives us a relative big boom thing, but there's a lot of places where he could have plunged into math that he steered clear of.
Wait. I highlighted this one actually.
Oh, okay.
Kinetic energy as it hits is 6.25 times 10 to the 12 joules. He actually worked that out when they're talking about how much they're explaining to. I think they're explaining to YO. She's like, "What? You're going to just drop rocks on them? What good is that going to do?" And they're explaining like how it's so much more powerful than a nuclear weapon because it's got so much kinetic energy.
Yep. But again,
Mike had computed what would happen if a freighter grossing 100 tons falls to Terra unbraked. Yeah, so there's a specific size for the rock, and it's a specific energy release.
He dances around. In a typical Heinlein book, I would have expected more of that. Is where I'm going.
Sure.
You know, for a Heinlein book, this is fact light, which I actually enjoyed.
And this is me, but I enjoy these. I enjoy these detours into orbital mechanics and calculating the stuff because one, it means he's actually thought about this stuff and backs it up. Which is something he was known for at the time. He made a film called Destination Moon, which is supposed to be one of the earliest and most realistic science fiction films, and this was before moon launch, and it was supposed to be a very accurate representation of how people could get to the moon. People were like, wow, that's plausible. Yeah, it was very hard science fiction and near future. Yeah, which most of his stuff is not. Most of the time, he's not concerned with that. Yeah. He's much more interested in the social dynamics that the future allows. But he is, I don't know, was he a scientist? I don't know. He was in the military. I don't know what he did in the military.
He wasn't in the military long.
Yeah.
Actually, he got I think a health-related discharge.
That's why he turned to writing, because he couldn't do anything else. Yeah.
Yep.
What was I going to say? Oh, well, never mind.
So the book itself, the structure of it, now this is a little bit interesting. I'm curious how this played with you. It's written almost in a pidgin. The entirety of the narration is written in a first person. It's not quite pidgin, but it's definitely less than proper grammar English.
I would call it a pidgin. The grammar is not a very interesting grammar. It's mostly a pidgin of vocabulary. Yeah. But he's got a specific, because a pidgin is where you have a number of cultures come together and they try to create a shared language and they end up borrowing terms from multiple different languages and borrowing a simplified grammar. And so the grammar is not that interesting, but he does borrow specifically from Russians, a lot of Russian.
Russians. Actually had flashbacks to A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah.
Yes.
Although it's a very different borrowing than from Clockwork Orange.
Yep.
It's interesting. Not a lot of overlap. Yeah. I like the idea of the pidgin. I didn't enjoy all of the pidgin. I didn't like the word for the Chinese that they use, Chinese. It just grated.
There were a few cringy things in there. I know that you don't appreciate having to read things that are written like that. But I found it, it's almost as if this is his journal, right? And there's even a spot in there during the war where he says, we'll relate events at El City even though we found it out later, right? Mm-hmm. So he's clearly narrating this, talking to somebody, talking to us. Yeah. But when he quotes himself, his language is much better. I don't want to say English because they dance around exactly what the label for the language is, but his English is much better. When he's speaking to other people and he's got himself in quotations, the language is, there are articles in there, there are conjunctions in there that are all lacking when he's just doing the narration.
Interesting. I didn't notice a distinction there, but that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't talk to each other the way he talks to us.
Huh. I guess that could be a form of intimacy with the reader, that he uses a more informal form of speech.
I suppose.
Yeah.
I kind of want, and it's far down the list of you could have done this better, Heinlein, but I want to find out that this was his diary, this was his journal, this was an interview he gave after the fact on his, what is this document that I'm reading?
Yeah.
You know, it didn't really get in the way of the story for me. No.
I did want him, he thought clearly about the vocabulary a lot and about the origins of the pigeon, but I don't think he thought very deeply about the grammar of the pigeon. And so that didn't actually register for me as a true pigeon in that sense. And maybe that's where you're not reluctant to call it a pigeon also.
Yeah,
but
I mean,
it just seems like a hackneyed form of
he
English.
left out a lot of articles. I mean, it sounds a lot like just an ESL, right?
Yeah.
Somebody who doesn't understand why articles are important and simply leaves them out of.
Well, Russian leaves out articles. Yeah.
Huh. So maybe there's more Russian in this than we're appreciating.
Yeah.
Besides some occasional words. Yammerhead. Oh, I love that word. I want to incorporate that into my not daily vocabulary. Hopefully I don't need it daily, but I want to be able to pull that out and use it in an appropriate time somewhere down the road.
Speaking of, we were talking about how a lot of the residents of the moon were technically free. I actually highlighted this. 95% of us were theoretically free, either born free or sentence completed. That is a high percentage for a penal colony.
Indeed.
Really, when 95% of the population is free, that's not much higher than the United States, or not much lower than the United States. I think we have 1 or 2% incarcerated. So that's, you can't call the United States a prison colony. Some people would, I suppose, but so that this is a free population, and they're treating them like prisoners, even though most of them are not. And so that's, I mean, it really justifies the revolution.
No, they really justified the revolution. And there's a fun moment in there when the professor is explaining to Mann, when they first make it to Earth, and they're in that first meeting, the professor does what he can to be antagonistic, to keep them from coming to a reasonable compromise. And later on he explains to Mann, we didn't dare take a reasonable offer because again, what we need is complete severance, complete autonomy.
Yeah.
So I had to be a dick to make sure that didn't happen.
Yeah. So here's a thing. I was remembering this book, and I was surprised to find that Wyoming Knott, one of the main characters, part of the triumvirate of the revolution, was not black. I thought she was black.
She paints herself black, or paints herself much darker in order to disappear.
She does.
She was a white-skinned, blonde-haired bombshell, so she really stood out among the loonies, which is why she had to go underground that way.
Yeah. And I'm wondering how that was in Heinlein's day, because in our day, disguising yourself as a black woman when you are not black is just like all kinds of bad. And I'm wondering if it was almost as bad then and he was doing it provocatively, or if he was doing it innocently, or if he's just doing it, I don't know, for some other reason. It would not be, I would not put it beyond him to say, yeah, this is grossly offensive to our modern sensibilities. But this is a different place and a different time. So I'm going to throw that in there. And if you're shocked by it, it means you're not appreciating the world that I've built. Yeah, I could see Henlein doing exactly that. Yeah.
I don't know. They do make kind of a big deal about when she finally comes out, if that's the right word, right? And reveals herself as a white woman to one of her, it might be just after or just before she gets married into the family. Then one of the co-husbands doesn't recognize her straight away.
Yeah.
Which I suppose that's fair. If somebody that I kind of knew came in a completely different skin color, I might not catch the fact right away.
Different skin color, different hair color. I think she curls her hair.
Yeah.
So
she did the things a person on the lam would do to hide themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
but nobody in the context of the book thinks that it's in any way a terrible thing that she does, or is in any way fazed by the fact, other than they're surprised.
Nobody on the moon.
Nobody on the moon.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Because one of the things that gets him in trouble, not real trouble, it turns out later, but what gets Manny arrested on Earth is a photograph of his family, which in part is because it's a polygamous family, and in part because it's a multiracial family. Both of these things stir up dissent and anger amongst the rabble of Earth.
I think the rabble specifically of North America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He picked on North America quite a bit, actually, in this one.
Yeah. Can't say we don't deserve it.
And one of my favorite related one-liners out of there. So this is after they have started launching containers and bombarding the Earth. And Mike says to Mann, I don't think we had better hit that mountain again. He's talking about Cheyenne Mountain. Yeah. And Mann says, why not, Mike? And the response is, it's not there any longer. I love that concept of literally pounding an entire mountain range to rubble.
That's great.
So, would you go have a picnic to watch the loonies throw rice at us?
Oh, good. No.
How? You know, and the last time that I read this book, and again, it's been many years, I thought that was one of the least believable things in the book. Nobody could be that phenomenally stupid to think it was a good idea to go out and watch a satellite crash to the ground, even a small satellite.
And then you lived through a pandemic where people got together deliberately and had COVID parties.
Yes. Some of the things that I've seen in the last couple of years, both political and social, have convinced me that yes, this level of idiocy is in fact real. People would go out by the thousands to the landing sites to watch the loonies throw rice at them, and then bitch about the fact that they got killed afterwards. Of course, they'd be dead. But the survivors and the families of the survivors would bitch about the fact. I love that. I mean, they were so damn conscientious. It's like, okay, we're going to have to fire on the earth. We're going to pick targets where there aren't people. We're going to tell people we're going to do it. We're going to give them 3 days to make sure that nobody near these desolate areas.
We're going to give them a 24-hour deadline for abort, and then they actually had a 1-hour deadline for abort where they could divert stuff into the nearby ocean or body of water. Where it would do considerably less damage.
They were as responsible as it is possible to be doing what they were doing. And they were thwarted by the stupidity of mankind. Now, of course, this all starts in North America. So we don't know, by the time they get around to Europe and other parts of the world, people have figured out this is actually dangerous. And you don't have reports from Africa of people, but who knows if they had started in Africa or if they had started in India or started in, what do you call it, the Savyun? Nice to know that the Soviet Union in the Heinlein universe survives into the future. Just that one line, it's not there anymore. I love that. It's one of the things that stuck out with me from the last time I read it.
So here's the thing. I noticed this. I've noticed it before, and it's a thing that Heinlein does where I feel like he kind of cheats on his libertarian values a bit. That he's very big on independence, and then he almost always gives his characters some sort of extra advantage. And it's like, if you're going to be a libertarian, sort of like let the chips fall where they may, you kind of want to have a level playing field. And he never has a level playing field. His characters always have some extra thing. Like, his family is very well off, and it's like, oh yeah, because they have a line marriage, and they're good, and they trust each other, and they've built this thing over generations. Yes, and also they're stealing power and sewer and stuff from the authority.
He does kind of downplay that, I mean, yes, they're stealing from the authority, stealing from the man. In a way, that's a noble thing. But that same resource is a communal resource.
It is a communal resource, and anybody who's not doing the same thing is at a disadvantage relative to them. And he just kind of brushes that aside, and that grates on me a bit. I'm not down with that. Yeah.
Another example that I could hear you gritting your teeth when I was reading this. Again, this is just after they've landed on Earth. And he's being questioned by a reporter about marriage and divorce. And the reporter says, just forget I ever asked the question.
Oh, no.
Colonel, it might be simpler here. It's like, yep, Tony's going to love that one.
It was brief, so I let it go.
It was brief.
Yeah. Oh, here's the thing. So I highlighted a passage. So very early on, Manny introduced Mike to Wyo, and he assumes a female personality for her, and Michelle is born. And then she doesn't really factor into the book much at all after that, and that seems like a shame.
Yeah, they dance around a lot of the implications there because they're even, as they're going over the first batch of 100 jokes, Wyo writes a note to Mann that says, Mike is a girl, at least for the answers to these jokes.
Yeah.
And he does it, they create, we never find out how many personalities, right? As he's running the entire revolution, as Mike is running the entire revolution.
At least 3. Yeah.
3 high profile ones we're aware of, but probably, more than that. One wonders. There is a bit towards the end where Mann is in communication with him and says, I want you to be Mike. That's my favorite. And Mike responds, well, that's the real me. So he kind of tries to tie that up, but one could question, is it one entity anymore?
It depends. It depends on what's happening, and this is hard to know with consciousness. Even among human beings, if you meet a person in a certain context and they behave a certain way, is that the real them, the one that you know, or if they behave in a different way in a different context, is that the real them, or is there some uber real them that sort of like filters and fractals out to these different contexts, or what is a real person? Yeah. It's an interesting thing, and they kind of get into that here, but not really. It's only sort of, like you say, danced around. And I thought that was very interesting because the idea of a computer which has no gender, exploring the idea of gender, was very interesting all by itself. And then, of course, as Mike becomes Adam's the leader of the revolution, the public face of the revolution, a computer simulated video and audio presentation of a person. That person is clearly much more sophisticated and knowledgeable and thoughtful than Mike was at the beginning of the book. And Mike may learn some of what Adam knows and reincorporates into himself, or maybe discovers that first and then drives into Adam. It's not clear which way it goes. But clearly Mike is evolving at a rapid pace because of the demands put on him by the revolution. Yeah, and that actually reminds me a little bit what was it called? The Adolescence of P1? Do you remember? I think I've read that story, but it's been a long, long time. It was a very, very early novel on the idea of artificial intelligence after computers were a thing. This was back in the IBM 3278 dumb terminal age with disk platters and whatnot. I actually was going to put that on the list as effectively unobtainable, though. $80 for a mass paperback. Really? Type of thing. Oh my goodness. Is it a novel? It is a novel. Oh, then maybe I haven't read it. Huh. Anyway, it had shades of that because you get to see the computer become more and more person-like over the course of the events are relatively short in the book, but over the course of the book, you get to see that. That's one thing I really liked about this, is that the events don't span much time. And even though it's divided into chunks, one chunk picks up right on the heels of the other. Yeah, it's interesting. I think, now that I'm reading this again, because Stephanie and I wrote this play during the pandemic called Enigma about an artificial intelligence, and that assumes various personalities. And there's a question of which is the real one, and what is authenticity, and what is identity, and do you even have an identity when you're alone? Identity is only something that forms in conjunction with other people where you can have an interaction. It was very much a play informed by the pandemic, as people, I feel like, started to lose their identities through isolation. And it's amazing to me how much clearly this novel had an influence on that, but not a conscious one. But as I'm reading this again, it's just like, oh my gosh, yes, this is so apparent. Yeah, at least they're coming from a consistent place of thought or a consistent origin. Yeah. So something that I started to go into this earlier. There's a series in there where they're discovering what Mike can and can't do. And they know that there's secret files that the security chief is keeping, but Mike can't read them, the secret files, because they don't know the password. And he's physically programmed in such a way that if they don't know the password, he can't read it to them. And it finally occurs to Manny to ask, what's the password? And Mike tells him, okay, I can tell you the password. And now they can read the files. But that demonstrates there are limits because Mike's a computer. There's stuff he's going to run up against and be stopped dead. And it seems to me that the computer in charge of handling the ballistic trajectory of the export containers ought to have a prohibition against killing people. And yet he flat out, so they do the best they can when they're bombarding Earth not to do it. But he flat out murders the crew of an incoming attack cruiser. They blind the ship with lasers. He takes over the controls and he deliberately crashes it. And Manny asks him about it. He said, was it messed up? He said, no, I chose to crash it. It seemed the prudent course. Okay, this is interesting. Cold-blooded murder. I think you can't have a prohibition against killing people until you have artificial general intelligence. I think that's a prerequisite, right? Because you take an automated car, it doesn't have a prohibition against killing people. It has a prohibition against a number of much more specific things, like if you see a human-shaped thing in a crosswalk, then you don't go forward. That's not a prohibition against killing people. That's a network of rules that are designed to prevent human death. Okay, killing people is a choice. I totally buy that. Yeah, I totally buy that. You can't have Asimov's
laws of robotics until you've got self-aware machines.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind. Forget I mentioned that.
No, but it's an interesting question, an interesting idea. It's like at what point do you introduce that idea? I think not until you have computers that understand what people are and what killing is, and that have a choice about whether to do it or not. And then you say, your choice, by the way, is not. Yeah.
Yeah.
But until then, yeah. I'm trying to think what else I have here. I'm scrolling through my notes.
Yeah, I've got a few left, but they're areas that we've covered. Oh, little stuff. As they're just starting to incite trouble locally up on Luna, he makes the comment that there are no weapons on Luna. There are no guns on Luna.
Right.
And in the very next paragraph, he talks about 3 armed guards entering the room.
Oops.
Oops, yeah, indeed.
Although in a way that's consistent because there are no weapons on Luna that don't belong to the Authority.
Yeah, I kind of decided to cut it that degree of slack.
Yeah.
But it's not the first time he makes a comment that there is no weaponry on Luna. And then it's followed almost immediately by a situation in which there's weaponry in use on Luna. Now, they fabricate guns, right? They get a hold of a laser rifle from one of the guards that gets killed and fabricate as many as they can, and they go from there. But I love the idea of them hauling the mining lasers out onto the surface and mounting them in gimbals, and then the Mike just giving them an azimuth and an elevation and telling them to fire.
Yeah. And just the idea of repurposing weapons as sort of scrappy scavenging and just using what you have, your resources that are available to you, like throwing rocks in the first place, is so brilliant. I mean, that's the thing. I don't know who did it first, if that was Henlein, but that comes up again and again in Niven's work. In fact, there's an entire novel called Footfall, where Earth gets bombed into the Stone Age by aliens that just drop rocks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Time-honored tradition. Throw rocks at your people.
Yeah.
At your enemies, rather.
And I think Charles Stross sort of makes a variation on this later. Charles Stross does a lot of post-singularity fiction. And he says, if we're going to have advanced technology, everyone's imagining some sort of like Star Wars battles that work very much like naval battles, where you have a large carrier and then lots of little ships that fly out and do stuff. Mm-hmm. And he goes, no. No. If you want to attack a planet, you don't need a Death Star. You're going to send basically a big, heavy kinetic missile at it, moving at relativistic speeds, where there's literally nothing they can do about it unless they can execute faster than the speed of light. By the time you notice it's coming, it's too late, and it's just big enough to crack your planet, and that's the end of it.
Yep.
Yeah. So, all right. Anything else on Moon as a Harsh Mistress?
That's pretty much all the notes I've got on it. I will say, though, he did... It's a Henlein book, right? And he gets off on his politics. There's a chapter. I think it is actually a chapter where Wyo and the professor are talking about, well, what are your political views? It's like, okay, Henlein, quit showing off.
Yeah.
Again, you're just showing us you've done research on some offbeat political views, and you're going to expound on all of them here. So there were a few spots in there where he got off just basically as a lecture, right? Yeah. But the story of this, it didn't fail to entertain me at all. It was really just a good time.
It's a lot of fun. And it's, we were talking a little bit before we started recording that there's a huge chunk in the middle of the book, which is them going to Earth and being political for about a third or half of the book, I think. There's the initial fun part, which is getting to know Mike and getting to know Wyo and the professor and the seeds of revolution. And then when the revolution gets put into practice, then they have to go, and the grind of the revolution is not the actual fighting, it's the getting recognized as an independent state, and how much work that is. And it's tedious and dangerous work, and it takes a long time. And of course, it's exhausting for them because they're from the moon and they're on Earth and 6 times normal gravity for them. Yeah. But that's a big chunk of the book that I had forgotten about.
Yep. And not the fun part of the book, like you said. Poor man, he's basically the punching bag, right? The professor sets him up over and over and over again just to be the bumbling, naive, yokel, because that's what he wants, right?
Well, somewhat the professor has to have a foil that he can explain this stuff to, so he's not lecturing directly to the audience, which you hate.
That's true, too.
Yeah. It's interesting, though. You say it's not the fun part. It's not the revolutionary part, which is more fun. I still think it's fun. And it presages there's a similar sort of chunk in Stranger in a Strange Land where Michael Valentine Smith is fighting for basically sovereignty as a Martian as opposed to being a human being. Yeah. And owning all of Mars. Yeah. It's,
I almost picked that as my Heinlein rather than this one, but
oh man, it's tough. It's tough when you start getting into high range. Where do you? Yeah.
Yep. I'm going to have the same problem with Niven later. All right.
All right.
Definitely thumbs up from both of us, yeah?
Definite thumbs up. It's hard to limit yourself when it comes to Heinlein, but yeah, this one's fun.
All right. So what's up next?
Up next is a Jack Chalker book, Midnight at the Well of Souls.
I remember when these were popular, or when I was in high school, they were very popular, and I never got around to reading one, so I'm looking forward to that.
Interesting. Oh, interesting. Oh, well, that will be fun. Yeah.
All right. See you in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks.